Ayesha is an ambitious teenager who loves reading and visiting the library. Her school is far from home, and the library is located midway. She often walks alone, but one particular day feels different. The ominous beginning. Strange occurrences start as Ayesha leaves school. A sudden drop in temperature, flickering streetlights, and eerie silences. A faint shadow seems to follow her, but every time she turns, there's no one there. The library incident. Ayesha reaches the library, where things seem normal at first, but she begins to hear whispers while browsing the shelves. She notices a book out of place, covered in dust, with no title. When she touches it, an overwhelming chill rushes through her. The walk home. The walk home becomes increasingly terrifying. Ayesha feels like she's being followed. She notices footprints in the dirt behind her, but they don't match her pace. Mysterious figures appear in the shadows, and the once familiar streets feel alien. The unfolding mystery. Ayesha recalls a story about a girl who disappeared on the same route years ago. She begins to question whether she's experiencing the supernatural or losing her grip on reality. The climax. Ayesha is cornered by an entity, forcing her to confront her deepest fears. She must use her wits and bravery to escape, uncovering a dark secret connected to the library and the route home. 7. Resolution. Ayesha narrowly escapes, but the experience changes her forever. She uncovers the truth about the ghostly presence, tying it to a tragedy from the past. The story ends on a chilling note, with a hint that the entity may not have fully disappeared. Ayesha had always enjoyed walking alone. It was her time to think, to daydream, and to escape the noise of school. The route from her school to the library was a familiar one, lined with quiet streets, old houses, and the occasional barking dog. But that day, something felt off. The first sign came as she left the school gates. The air seemed colder than usual for an autumn afternoon, and the streetlights, though it was still daylight, flickered faintly. Ayesha shook off the unease, tightening her scarf around her neck and clutching her school bag tighter. She told herself she was just being silly. After all, she had walked this path dozens of times without incident. The library was her sanctuary. A small, dusty building tucked away on a quiet street. It was where she spent hours lost in books. That day, she was particularly excited to borrow a new mystery novel. But as she walked, the world around her seemed to shift. A soft rustling sound caught her attention. She glanced back, expecting to see a squirrel darting through the leaves. But there was nothing, just the empty street stretching behind her. Ayesha's pace quickened. By the time she reached the library, she couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching her. The librarian greeted her warmly, and the familiar scent of old books soothed her nerves. But as she wandered through the aisles, the whispers began. At first, she thought it was just her imagination, but as she moved deeper into the library, the whispers grew louder. She turned a corner and saw it. A dusty, tattered book sitting on the edge of a shelf, completely out of place. Her fingers hesitated before picking it up. The cover was blank, and the pages inside were faded, covered in strange symbols she couldn't understand. The moment she touched it, a chill shot through her body, and the whispers stopped. Shaking her head, she placed the book back on the shelf and decided it was time to leave. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the street as she stepped outside. The walk home was usually the best part of her day, but tonight, the streets felt unfamiliar, almost sinister. As Ayesha walked, the shadows seemed to stretch and move. The faint sound of footsteps echoed behind her, but when she turned, no one was there. Her heart pounded as she clutched her bag tighter, her eyes scanning every corner. The houses, once comforting and familiar, seemed to loom over her, their windows like dark, watching eyes. If you want to hear this story, let me in comment below. I will upload second part of this video and make to subscribe to my YouTube channel for more interesting, chilling stories. The Library Incident. Ayesha pulled the library door open, the familiar creak of its hinges echoing through the empty space. The warmth inside the building was a welcome contrast to the chill outside. The librarian, a gray-haired woman with kind eyes, gave her a nod from behind the counter. "Good evening, Ayesha," the librarian said. Her voice as soft and comforting as always. Ayesha managed a small smile. "Hi, Mrs. Sharma. Just here for a new book." The librarian returned to her work, and Ayesha stepped into the maze of shelves. She had been coming to this library since she was a child, and every corner of it was etched into her memory. The faint scent of aging paper hung in the air, mingled with the occasional hint of lavender from the librarian's perfume. Normally, this place made her feel safe. Tonight, though, something felt different. As she wandered through the aisles, the overhead lights flickered briefly. Ayesha froze, her gaze darting upwards. The lights steadied, and she shook her head, laughing nervously at her own paranoia. "You're just tired," she muttered to herself, running her fingers along the spines of books. "Nothing weird is happening." But then she heard it. A faint whisper, so soft it was almost drowned out by the hum of the lights. Ayesha turned her head sharply, her eyes scanning the empty aisle behind her. The library was silent. The only sound was the faint rustle of the librarian's pen on paper at the front desk. "Hello?" she called out softly, her voice trembling just slightly. The whisper stopped. Ayesha took a deep breath, reminding herself that she was alone and safe. She continued browsing, her fingers trailing along the spines until one caught her attention. The book was different from the others. It sat awkwardly on the shelf, jutting out as if it didn't belong. Its cover was worn and faded, with no title or markings to indicate what it was. Curiosity got the better of her, and she pulled it out. The book was heavier than it looked. Ayesha opened it carefully, her brow furrowing as she examined the pages. They were filled with strange symbols and drawings, circles, lines, and what looked like ancient scripts she couldn't understand. Some of the pages were torn, and others were stained with something dark and rusty. As she flipped through the book, that same whispering sound began again, louder this time. It seemed to come from all around her, like 100 voices murmuring just out of reach. The hair on the back of her neck stood up, and her hands trembled slightly as she held the book. "What is this?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. She looked over her shoulder, half expecting someone to be standing there. The aisle was empty, but the whispers continued, growing louder with each passing second. It was as if the walls themselves were alive, breathing secrets into the air. A sudden chill enveloped her, and she gasped, dropping the book. It hit the floor with a thud, and the whispers stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was deafening. Ayesha's chest rose and fell rapidly as she tried to steady her breathing. She crouched down to pick up the book, but something stopped her. On the ground next to the book was a single footprint. It was wet, as if someone had just stepped there, and it was far too large to belong to her. Ayesha's heart pounded in her chest as she stared at it, frozen in place. The footprint wasn't just wet. It was dark, almost black, and seemed to shimmer slightly in the dim light. "Mrs. Sharma?" Ayesha called out, her voice shaking. She clutched the book tightly to her chest and backed away from the footprint, her eyes darting around the aisle. "Is someone here?" There was no response. The librarian's desk was just a few steps away, But when Ayesha turned the corner, it was empty. The pen Mrs. Sharma had been using rolled off the counter and hit the floor, the sound unnaturally loud in the silence. Ayesha felt a lump rise in her throat. The library, her sanctuary, now felt like a trap. "I'm leaving," she whispered to herself, clutching her bag tightly. She placed the book back on the shelf without looking at it again and turned toward the exit. Her footsteps echoed loudly as she hurried toward the door, but just as she reached it, she heard the whispers again. This time, they were louder than ever, and they weren't coming from the shelves. They were coming from right behind her. Ayesha froze, her hand on the door handle. She didn't want to turn around, didn't want to see what might be there. The whispers grew louder, the voices overlapping in a cacophony of sounds that made her head spin. It felt like the walls were closing in on her, the air growing colder and heavier with each passing second. "Run!" a voice hissed, distinct and clear among the whispers. Ayesha didn't need to be told twice. She yanked the door open and ran into the night, her heart pounding in her chest. The cold air stung her face as she sprinted down the street, her footsteps echoing loudly against the pavement. She didn't look back, didn't stop running until the library was far behind her. But as she slowed down, trying to catch her breath, she realized something chilling. The whispers hadn't stopped. They were still there, faint but persistent, following her into the darkness.